Let me just mention that the use of trade names or brand names in this evening's presentation is for clarity and information purposes only. It is not to endorse any products or exclude any products that may not be mentioned. It's just a way for us to have a more effective and hopefully clear communication. So let me just say that one of the things that you will be receiving by email from me if you're on Zoom is a list of a number of resources that were used in tonight's presentation. There'll be some topics this evening that we won't go in great depth, just given the amount of time we have before you. And so this will be a resource for you to use and be able to find those resources. Those of you here in person tonight, we have several of those printed out, as well as if there's any that you'd like to have printed out that I don't provide for you this evening, just let me know. We're happy to do that. So one of the primary resources that I used, coincidentally, has the same name as our presentation this evening, Fall Vegetable Gardens or Fall Vegetable Gardening. And so what we're doing this evening is just taking a look at what a fall vegetable gardening is and how to get started. And so the way I think of fall vegetable gardens is it's a way to extend that growing season past kind of the typical summer harvest season. In truth, we really have three periods in this area where we can do vegetable gardens. We can do spring gardens or an early garden where we grow a lot of things that are very insensitive to cool temperatures. So it's things like peas and lettuce and green onions and our cold crops or brassicas, stuff like cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower. All those we can produce well in the spring. They don't do well in the heat of summer, but we also get the opportunity to try them again in the fall. And in fact, on some of those, we actually maybe have more success with them in the fall. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through this. You can look at it as just a way of continuing what you're doing in the garden. So many of the things that we do grow during the heat of summer will continue to do well in a fall garden. And so you can think of it just planting another succession or another planting just to continue on with your harvest. But it is not an exact mirror of your spring garden either. And because of that, it gives us more variety in the garden. Because certainly, when we're planting peas out, I know at least one gardener in the region who pre-sprouts his peas, and he plants them out typically on Valentine's Day. So that's very early for our area, really. And he's successful with it. He does well with that. And that's because peas are very tolerant of cool conditions. And by pre-sprouting them, he's given them that jump start that they would just kind of sit there in the really cold soil. Obviously, we wouldn't try to do that with tomatoes that time of year. But, it's a scenario where it's not the exact mirror of a spring, but sometimes there are some things that we can duplicate with both spring and fall crops. So if you are missing some of your spring favorites, you might get a chance to try them again with a fall garden. So there's a lot of opportunities that fall gardens present for us. I think of it as also kind of like a second opportunity for a vegetable garden for a lot of folks. One, it's very rare that I find a gardener who says they have too much space or, they have too big of a garden. A lot of people complain they don't have enough space. So if you have limited space or maybe you have limited time, you can't put as much time into your garden as you would like. By having a second garden in the same spot, you're able to do more. So it gives you that opportunity to have more garden than you might otherwise be able to with your circumstances. It's also a great thing that if we have a bad growing season. So far this growing season has been a little odd, I think. We've been hot, we've been cold, we've been hot again, we've been cold again. And so we've seen some things that maybe aren't doing as well as they might some years. Even commercial growers I know have been talking about tomatoes, for instance, have been very slow to go ahead and fully ripen this season. So if you're experiencing that at home, you're not alone with that. And so, I think sometimes having that fall garden is kind of a chance for a do-over. If something didn't do as well as you would like, if you were hoping to do some preserving and maybe you didn't have enough, fall garden can give you that opportunity to go ahead and have a volume of produce there for use. And certainly it's still great for things like fresh eating and for preserving. It gives you that kind of end of the season opportunity to still, whether it's freezing, canning, or whatever, gives you that opportunity. So I think there's a lot of reasons to try fall gardens. There's a few preparations that we do want to do before we get started. And one of those is because oftentimes we are going into a gardening spot that has been in use for that season. We want to look at removing any finished or spent plants or crops. And the reason we want to do that, so, oftentimes you get done with harvesting things and the plants are still growing, sort of, depending exactly what they are, but they're looking rough. And the reason we want to pull those out from there is they can kind of serve as a nursery for insects and diseases. And so if you have a tomato crop that's kind of on its last legs, if you just leave the plants there, they're going to continue to be there and be a source of food and habitat for those diseases and insects. And so that's why we'd want to remove those. So as you're going through the garden now, this time of year, as a crop is finished, as you're done harvesting it, that's when you want to pull those crops physically out, remove the plants. And so what that does prevent carrying over those pests. Rotating crops, I think, is very important. One of the big tools we have with disease, but also to some extent insects, is rotation between crop families to prevent populations or problems from building up. And so we do want to pay attention what crop family plants are in. One of the clickable links that you'll get from me is actually a handout that talks about that. We won't go into depth tonight, but just understanding that and putting as much time in between related crops is a good thing always. It's not only about disease and insects, which can be a problem, but also even just nutrient cycling in the garden. If you put plants in there that use the same nutrients in large amounts, over time, you get a deficit. Yes.
Now, my tomato plants last year, as they were starting to ripen, the birds would come and take a peck from one and a peck from another. I mean, they wouldn't just eat one, they have to peck them all. How do you keep the birds from eating your tomatoes?
Okay, so we had a question from the folks here live with us. How do you keep animal pests from eating your tomatoes? So if you have birds pecking, I've seen squirrels that do the same sort of thing where they will sample a number of different tomatoes before they apparently find one that's to their liking. Honestly, the only truly reliably effective method is exclusion, so netting. Netting that you can place over those plants works well. It doesn't have to be anything too dramatic with, your setup with it. If you have just a few plants, then just draping it over the plants, having some stakes in there to take the main weight off the plant so you don't distort new growth or break any new growth. But certainly physical exclusion works very well for animal pests. And that's when it becomes more challenging. Is when you have a larger planting. And so there are, products and things such as noise cannons and things like that. Most of those over time, animal pests become, they no longer are effective. They more or less get used to it. It becomes background noise. So I would probably say still physical exclusion for animal pests is going to be your best bet. And it may be that you look at maybe just doing part of them if it is too physically large of a thing to do. But good question. So rotating crops is important. Another thing I want to talk about for just a moment is fertility with your garden. So sometimes I run into home gardeners who aren't doing a good job with fertility. And what I mean by that is they are not utilizing fertilizer. And fertilizer can come in many different forms. Some folks prefer the more organic or more natural products, such as manure-based products or compost. And those certainly work well in our garden. But there's also those fertilizers that are largely derived from petroleum. So they're inorganic fertilizers. They work great. Truthfully, your plant doesn't know the difference when it comes down to what the source is because they pick up ions. And so ions, if it's a nitrate ion, whether it came from manure, or whether it came from a petroleum-based fertilizer to the plant, it doesn't make a lot of difference. Now, there are some good positive things about organic or natural fertilizers like compost, for instance, because it's adding organic matter to our soil. And organic matter allows our soils to hold more nutrients as well as more water. It can help if you have heavy clay soils with loosening it. So organic matter added to our soils is always a good thing. Don't want to in any way say it's not. But oftentimes utilizing sometimes a combination of both the more natural and organic products, as well as the inorganic products, can give us the best of both worlds. because organic and natural products typically have to be broken down by the soil microbial community before they're available to plants. And that takes time, especially early in the season when we have cool soils. That process is slow. And so that's where utilizing a more rapidly available inorganic fertilizer in the garden can be a good tool. And so that may be something you want to consider. But because we're talking about with a fall garden, often, like I said, going back into the same area where we've been growing already, we really want to take care to add in sufficient nutrients. So even if we use fertilizer, and we should have with the earlier crop, we need to start again. And so a good rule of thumb is to apply 2 pounds of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square feet when you plant. So what in the world do I mean when I say actual nitrogen? So whenever we look at fertilizers, for instance, and you see there on the screen 10-10-10, it's a great fertilizer commonly available. What's bad about it is it's horrible for this example. So let's instead say we have a 10-11-12 fertilizer. Now, don't go to the store and ask for a 10-11-12 fertilizer, because I don't believe one exists, and they'll look at you like you're crazy. And if you tell them I sent you, they'll think I'm crazy then. So let's don't do that. But for purposes of this illustration, let's say we have a 10-11-12 fertilizer. What that tells us, it's 10% nitrogen, 10% P2O5, and 10% potassium, or K2O. And the reason that's important is when I talk about actual nitrogen, if I'm telling you to apply 2 pounds of actual nitrogen and your product has 10% nitrogen in it, then that means you would have to apply 20 pounds of that fertilizer over 1,000 square feet to get 2 pounds of actual nitrogen. And so depending on the concentration of nitrogen in your fertilizer product, it's going to vary how much of that fertilizer you use. So composts, for instance, are often very low in their actual available content of nutrition. So, that's where you're looking at maybe adding quite a bit of material to get to that actual application. So maybe a mixture of both inorganic as well as organic is a good example of a good time to do it. So just understand that when we talk about fertility applications, generally we are talking about the actual application of those nutrients. And so it varies depending on what product you're using. Another thing I think that's important to have success with a fall garden, even more so maybe than our typical gardens, is the ability to irrigate or water your garden. So certainly almost any given garden season, there are going to be periods when we're hot and dry, and it's going to be to your advantage to have the option to irrigate or to water your garden. And so what we're doing with a fall garden is typically we're starting out in some of the hottest, warmest periods and as well as driest. And so if we don't have the ability to get those plants up and going well and starting with a good step forward, success is going to be more difficult for that season. And so whenever we can actually irrigate these fall gardens, it's good. Remember, a few rules of thumbs with watering or irrigating: infrequently but deeply is best. So what do I mean? I'd rather you water 2 or 3 times a week, but really get the soil wet to 6 inches, rather than watering every day and only watering the top 2 inches of the soil. If you just water shallowly, that's where your roots are going to stay, is very shallow. That means they're not going to find nutrients that are further down or water that's stored in your soil. You can actually check and see how far you're wetting by literally digging in your garden. I would recommend it. That way, am I really wetting down to 6 or 8 inches, which is where we would like to be, or am I watering too little and it's creating a shallow watering? So again, infrequently but deeply is best. Drip systems or soaker hoses are great. They work well. You don't have to have them in your garden. You can do well with a wand or just a garden hose. But keep in mind, one reason we like those sort of systems that are putting the water directly to the soil, it's a little more efficient on water use because you are putting it to the soil, which is where the roots are, and you're not wetting the plant. So wet plants are more likely to have disease problems. And it's because all the different fungal pathogens, bacteria, and things like that, they need wet conditions to thrive and grow and expand. And so if we're wetting the plant, then they're happier. And that's why if you grow during a wet season, when we have a lot of rain, there are more disease problems. If you do water in a way like overhead with a wand or something like that, that does get plants wet, water early enough in the day that they can dry out as the day goes on. So you wouldn't want to water, late in the evening at dusk and then have them wet all night before they can dry out the next day. So if you have to get the plants wet, do it earlier in the day so they can dry out, or try to look at doing a method that doesn't get the plant wet as much. We like using mulches in our garden, and there can be any number of different sources that we use. Certainly we can use plastic mulches, for instance, but typically those would then force us to use drip irrigation underneath them. So lots of times for home gardeners, we don't see plastic used often for that. There's also the challenge of how do you dispose of the plastic at the end of the season. So certainly it's an option, maybe not the best or strongest for the home gardener. But things like straw or 3 inches of wood chips are good. Some people also use compost itself as a physical mulch. One thing to be aware of when we are using things that are rich in carbon, such as straw, such as wood chips, is that as they break down and degrade, we can have nitrogen limited in those areas. And so what happens is the nitrogen is actually grabbed by the microbes that are breaking down those high carbon materials, because those microbes are looking at eating carbon and using nitrogen to replicate. And really it's a blurring of both, but I always simplify it for myself and say they eat the carbon and use the nitrogen for replication. So it makes sense. If we throw a lot of food there for those microbes, they're going to want to reproduce because conditions are great. And so they'll grab all the available nitrogen and the plant is going to be lacking. There's not going to be a sufficient amount there. So if we are using these more carbon-rich mulches, I would encourage you to look at adding some additional nitrogen with your fertility. So maybe 10% extra. Certainly, pay attention to your plants, watch them. Nitrogen deficiency on plants is typically yellowing in the older leaves, because the plant will actually move nitrogen around in the plant from older leaves to younger leaves. So it's not an absolute guarantee that if you see yellowing on older leaves, that must be nitrogen deficiency, but that is a good clue that it could be. And so just be aware of that. It's not that the nitrogen goes anywhere. And in fact, whenever those microbes start dying, they'll re-release that nitrogen that they had. So it's not that we're losing it, but it is for a time becoming unavailable to those plants. And so that's why we do want to offset that somewhat by providing additional nitrogen to our gardens. I will also say too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So whether we're talking about fertilizer products or mulch products, earlier this week, I was called out to a home and they had used about 10 inches of wood chips on their garden. And the garden was showing absolutely severe issues with nitrogen deficiency. Everything was extremely yellow, except a couple of places where the wood chips were very few in number. Those plants look pretty good. So it's pretty easy to connect the dots on that one. Certainly, wood chips are a great mulch, but when we put too much of them into the environment, I think it causes more problems. So I would say about 3 inches of wood chips would be a maximum you'd want to use on your garden. Certainly, they're great to use in the general landscape as well. But again, moderation, I think, is key with this, and I wouldn't go over 3 inches of any of these mulch products. So just be aware of that. So what is the biggest consideration when it comes to a fall garden? To me, it's all about the timing of it, because basically the question we have to ask and then use that to influence what we do is, when will the growing season end? And so we're basically looking at how many days does it take for that plant to have a crop reach harvest versus when is our expected first frost date. So first frost dates are not exact science, so you'll see some various suggestions out there for our region, but I think around October 10th is pretty reasonable. Certainly, if you are in Mountain City, you may have a date that's earlier than that. And maybe if you're in the heart of Johnson City with a lot of urban heat island effect, you might see a date later than that and it'd be accurate. But probably this is a fair estimate over our area of around October 10th. So what does this kind of mean? That expected first frost date literally means that 90% of the time the first frost will occur no earlier than that date. So 10% of the time it will. So it doesn't mean that we can't have a frost earlier than that. Certainly we can, but as a rule, 90% of the time, it's around that time period that we would have it or later. So just be aware how that works. Frost, if you're not aware, what happens literally is water vapor condenses on a surface that has reached 32 degrees, so it actually freezes. So we can think of it as a frozen form of dew, but the air temperature itself is actually warmer. So it's not that we have a true freeze, but we actually have just a frost. The problem is those ice crystals forming in the plant tissues cause cells to rupture and die. And so that's why if you've ever seen plants after a frost, oftentimes the leaves are very dark and even watery looking. That's because quite literally the cells have broken and all those internal fluids have released. And so that's why it looks like that. It literally has gotten wet by nature of those cells breaking. And so what you find is different plants have varying degrees of sensitivity to frost or even freezing, a hard freeze, where the air temperature will actually be below freezing as well. Frosts are also very much local. And so what do I mean by that? Especially in our area where we have rolling hills and mountains and everything, there are areas that are more likely to frost than others. And that is because cold air flows like water. It flows downhill. And so what this graphic is depicting is that we can actually take advantage of that. So if you've ever wondered why are so many orchards planted on hillsides, this is why. Because in those spring frosts, where we're having a late frost, a couple of degrees warmer temperature on a hillside versus down in the valley can be the difference between a crop surviving a frost and not surviving a frost. And so that's why they plant on those hillsides, because air is allowed to cool down in the valley areas. And so the valley is a little bit colder. By the same token, with what we do with our landscape, with our environment, we can create frost pockets. So if you have a hillside, but you have it densely planted, you can actually cause that cold air to stall out, as you see depicted there. And so you'll create a frost pocket up on the side of the hill. Buildings will do the same thing. So you may see that a building can actually impede the flow of that cold air. And so frost events can be very much sensitive about where they're occurring in the topography of your land. So just be aware of that and maybe take that in consideration about where you might plant some things. And certainly fruit trees are a great example. What's good is we do have the ability to not allow that October 10th date just to be the finality of our garden. We can go beyond it. We can go beyond it because there are a number of different of our garden plants that are actually tolerant of frost and even freezes. And so here on the screen, you see some of those that are in our garden. So we have a number of things that are tolerant of light frost. So that means that these would not be knocked out just because we have that frost around the 10th. There are some things that can handle freezes into the high 20s. You can see there are things like beets, green onion, peas, even radishes are great at that. And then we have things that actually can handle hard freezes that, pretty much they just keep going. Things like Brussels sprouts, collard greens, and kale. And so certainly we can take advantage of this. It means that just because we've had a frost doesn't mean we can't still have a garden that's actively growing, because especially in our region, it's not unusual that we'll have our first frost of the season, and then there'll be 3 weeks of great, beautiful weather after it. And so it definitely doesn't mean that that frost date is the absolute end to what we can be doing in the garden. So where do we find out some of this information to make these informed decisions? Well, days to harvest. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as days to maturity. But basically, we can typically find this on packets. So seed packets will have it. If you're buying plants and they've got the tag in it, typically it will have it. And certainly catalogs often have it in their description. So it's not too hard to find. Some of the resources, materials that you have from me will actually have a range of days to harvest. And so it will vary based on the different cultivars. Some of them are quicker, some of them a little bit slower. And the other thing to understand is this, of course, is not an absolute. Just because it says that it's a 55-day tomato doesn't mean that you will absolutely have a harvest at day 55 from transplanting. It does vary based on weather. So if you're warmer than normal or colder than normal, that will affect it. And so it's just a good rule of thumb to compare between different varieties. But it should, again, give you the idea, is this an earlier maturing or a later maturing variety? I did just mention it now, but it bears repeating that on those crops that we typically transplant into the garden, so things like tomatoes and peppers, broccoli, cabbage, things of that nature, when we're looking at days to harvest on those, typically it is referencing when we're transplanting into the garden, not when we're seeding a transplant or even direct seeding in the garden. So just be aware of that. Most transplants need about 4 to 6 weeks to mature before they go into the garden. So if you're looking at creating your own transplants for some of the crops that are an option for our fall garden, we've kind of passed the window on that. So some of our more warm season crops, if you just seeded them now, like tomatoes, for instance, they'd be a little late getting to the garden. And so do understand that that may mean you have to purchase some rather than grow your own, or be aware that next season you'll have to start a little bit earlier. What we like to do is actually look at calculating when we need to plant for a given crop. So we'll look at warm season crops. These would be crops that will be killed by a frost event. And so these are our more warm season plants. So it's got to mature. We've got to reach full time to harvest prior to that frost event. So the first thing we want to do is we don't just want to have a plant that has, for instance, a tomato that we get to pull one tomato off and then the next day there's a frost event, because we put in a lot of work and effort and we want to have a harvest period that gives us some reward for that. So to begin with, we're actually going to look at adding 14 days or giving ourselves 14 more days before that first frost. So you can kind of think of it as subtracting 14 days from that first frost date, so we have more of a harvest available to us. The other thing we need to consider is we're doing kind of the exact opposite of what we normally do in the garden season. Normally in the garden season, we start off cooler and we go warmer. We're doing the exact opposite with a fall garden. So we're starting warm and going cooler. And so because of that, as things are cooling down, a number of biochemical processes in those plants slow down. So because of that, we're going to actually add some time to those days to maturity, because most of the time days to maturity are in fact referencing the main cropping season for that plant. And so we want to make sure that just because we're a little bit cooler, we still have time to get to full maturity. And so what that literally means is we have a warm season crop, those frost sensitive crops, we basically add 24 days to the days of maturity to figure out when we need to plant. And is 24 days exact? No, it's just a rule of thumb. If you want to add 25 because the math is easier, certainly go right ahead. But it's just a way to give us a buffer, and we'll illustrate why in a moment, so that we can have more time to crop that given plant. Cool season crops, those that are frost tolerant or even freeze tolerant, we've basically got a lot more leeway with them. So we can either just start counting back from the first frost date, or we can push the harvest date even later. So we might actually decide, well, we don't just want to stop then, we want to harvest 3 weeks after that first frost date. And one thing that we'll mention, and we'll show it in an example, because these are cool season crops, we don't actually need to do any sort of fall adjustment to them, because they're actually going to be starting out warmer than maybe they might absolutely love, and then going into those cooler temperatures where they'll thrive. So they actually will do better as the season goes along. And so because of that, we aren't adjusting them in the same way that we do the warm season crops. So we'll give an example here. So here's why we do this calculation and why we look at adjusting things. So what you see there is a normal distribution or a bell curve. And all it is, it basically says things start slow, they build speed, it kind of tops out, and then it slows down again on the other side, more or less in mirror to the same way it started and sped up. Now, do harvest exactly do a bell curve? No, not always, but it's still a decent approximation of things in the garden. So what happens is, let's say we don't do the 24 days. Let's say we just count back from our first frost date for something like summer squash. Well, we may begin the harvest, get a little bit of harvest, and then here comes the frost. The frost would be that red line. And so we did a lot of work in the garden and we haven't got a lot of harvest out of it. But let's say we shift that planting date by adding in those additional 24 days. Now suddenly we've got most of the harvest possible out of that plant before we see a frost. And so all we've done is moved our planting date so we get more harvest prior to that frost date. And so that's basically the key to fall gardening. When do we plant so we can get the best harvest from what we grow in our gardens? It's basically what's going to give us the best reward. And so that's why we deal with adjusting these dates. So we'll run with the yellow squash example. It takes about 50 days to harvest. Because it is a frost sensitive or warm season crop, we're going to add 24 days. So generally we would say it needs to be about 74 days prior to the frost date. If our frost date is approximately October 10th, then the last day we should be planting, or when we need to be planting, is around July 28th. Now, keep in mind, this is not an exact science. That doesn't mean if you plant on August 4th that you won't have a great harvest. It just means this is going to give us a little bit of insurance that we are doing a good job with it. So just keep in mind, these are all estimates. And in fact, if we look at one of the resources, you'll be getting the Fall Vegetable Gardens resource. That date kind of falls dead in the middle of the planting interval in there. So this publication keeps in mind, covers the entire state. So certainly the Memphis season looks a little bit different than ours since they're warmer, have a little bit longer season. And so what I have found is the planting interval, which is the third column you see there, most of ours, the most appropriate time to plant hits about the middle of the recommendation. And so you can see there, that was July 28th, if I haven't forgotten already. And that's kind of dead middle of that planting interval there. And certainly we can plant earlier than that. That's just going to give us a harvest earlier. And so just be aware that if we start planting significantly later than that. So let's say instead of doing, the end of July, early August, we go to the end of August. Well, now suddenly we may run into a situation where we're not getting much harvest at all before we get that frost. And so that's why we look at these dates. And again, as a good general rule of thumb for our region, most of the planting interval dates in this publication, we would be about the middle of them, would be most appropriate. What about a cool season crop? Well, let's say broccoli, for instance. So broccoli is about 65 days to harvest from transplant. This is one of those we would ordinarily transplant. So we can do this two ways. So let's say we really want to have harvest coming out of our garden even after our first frost. So we can actually move our harvest date back from that first frost to, let's say, 2 weeks later, to the 24th. So if we do that, then we would count back 65 days from, and I see a typo there on the bottom that should say October 24th, not November 1st. Which would be about August 20th. So with broccoli in our area, if we want to have a later harvest date of around October 24th, we'd be planting around August 20th, give or take. And certainly if we wanted to harvest earlier, well, if we wanted to harvest in early October, well, that means we would be planting earlier in August. So again, keep in mind that with these cool season crops, we can go past that first frost date. That's not a date that is truly that meaningful to us with these crops because the frost isn't going to bother it. It's going to be tolerant of it. So when we have frost tolerant crops, we can look at pushing that harvest date even beyond our first frost date.
What zone are we at?
We are in zone 6, I think is the latest update. And there is like a 6A and 6B, and I never can remember which one we are. The truth is, there's variability within the zones. And so again, part of it goes back to if you're in a more urban area, you're going to see warmer temperatures versus if you're more in a rural area, to be a little bit cooler. And also those topographical effects of are you on the hill, are you in the valley, all that comes into play. So zones are pretty good as a ballpark, but sometimes they need to be a little more informed by what's happening in your garden and where it's at. So
we still think you did the garlic, planted the garlic like right before the frost in the fall, and then you took it out in spring.
well, with garlic, typically planting in September is good. And really, as long as the ground's not frozen, you can go into winter even with garlic. And then typically we begin harvesting garlic later May to June. We basically let the plants tell us when to harvest it. When they start yellowing is when we pull it. And so, yeah, so something like garlic, we can actually, if you talk to a lot of growers who have done it, sometimes things will get away from them and they don't get it out till very late and they still do well with it. So, and there is variability from year to year. I know in 2019, I believe. So yeah, 2019, there was a grower I'm familiar with up in Southwest Virginia he was a commercial grower. He was growing cabbage and he got his cabbage transplants probably 6 or 8 weeks too late. And so he ended up in a bad situation with a grower who got behind. And so he already had his fields prepared, already had applied the fertilizer. He's like, well, I might as well go ahead and plant them and see what happens. So he actually did that. Turns out he was cutting cabbage in January. Now, there are going to be years where that does not work out so well. That's not going to always happen. That year, it happened to work out that he was able to cut cabbage then. And so, there is a variability from year to year on this. And so there are some years where you may not have tomatoes die from a frost until well into November. Now, those last several weeks, tomatoes aren't going to be super happy. They want warmer temperatures. But sometimes we do have some unique circumstances from year to year. So just keep in mind that, these dates, these estimations are somewhat conservative. And it's not to say that we can't plant later. It's just this is a good rule of thumb for safety. So again, because we have these cool season crops that can tolerate a frost, we can either push the date even on beyond the first frost date for harvest or not. We can leave it as it is, or maybe we have more than one planting date for these crops. It all just comes down to what are you wanting to pull out of your garden? Would you rather have one big harvest of broccoli and do some freezing, for instance, or would you rather have fresh eating over a number of weeks? How you plant and when you plant is going to decide that for you. So because these plants are adapted to cooler temperatures, we really don't look at adding any days for that cooler temperature factor, the fall factor. And so we just kind of figure out when do we want that harvest. So, and again, looking at that reference from fall vegetable gardens, you can see that if we don't adjust those dates, we would be hitting maybe as early as as August, 1st of August for our area, as far as a planting date, but certainly we can go quite a bit later because broccoli is itself a very much frost tolerant crop. So just be aware of that. We do have a lot of leeway with those frost tolerant crops. So I've kind of alluded to it and even said it earlier, but what do we do if we're a few days past that, perfect calculated date? Try it anyway. This is not in any way, shape, or form an exact science. If you're a little late, you're going to probably still be okay most years. Now, occasionally there may be that unusual happening where you have something that doesn't work out so well. That's kind of gardening. There's very few years that everything goes great for us, but certainly, there's enough estimating to this whole practice that it's worth going ahead and trying, even if your timing's a little bit off. The other thing you can do is do something a little bit more involved, but it gives you a little bit more options as well. So that's looking at some season extension options. So floating row covers. Floating row covers basically are fabric-like materials that we can put over our crops. They're also used as insect barriers in some crops. So we use these even during the main growing season for some things. And so basically there are lightweight ones that can give us about 5 degrees of protection. There are heavyweight ones that can give us maybe 10 degrees of protection, but the heavier you go, the less light that is allowed through. So there is a definite trade-off there. There's different brand names out there. Some commonly seen companies are Remay, Agribon, but there are many others. And so what's great about them is they do give you that extra protection. It is a way to trap the heat energy that's being released from the soil. And because of that, you get that protection. So you do need to have the edges sealed against the ground. And so lots of times, especially in the home garden, you're looking at utilizing something like boards or even bags of gravel. Certainly you can bury the edges just with a shovel and dirt. But, you know, however it works best for your garden, it does need to be sealed to that ground. They can be supported with hoops and wires, and particularly the heavier weight ones need that, so you're not crushing or deforming plants. But the lighter ones certainly can just float over the top of the plants, and typically without any negative issues. You basically want to make sure that these are in place, you know, as you go into those cooler nights. Certainly, if you're using them for pest control, you may keep them on all the time. If you do that, be aware of pollination. So there are some crops that these are often used for in organic production because there aren't great insecticides for certain pests. One of them I can think of like cucumber beetles with any of the cucurbit crops like melons and cucumbers. So when the plants are young, these are left sealed over top of the crops. The lighter weight ones does a great job. Quite literally, the cucumber beetles can't get to the plants, so they don't eat on them. Don't bring the diseases that those beetles can vector. But when you have flowering, you have to get those covers off there because you've got to get those pollinators. You got to get bees in there so that we can have squash or cucumbers, as the case may be. And so because of that, be aware what you're growing. If you need to be mindful of it, pay attention to pollination, and when flowers are starting, remove those covers. But these can be something that can be very easily used in the garden. They can extend the season, especially for the very frost tolerant or even freeze tolerant crops, quite a bit. And so you see there's some pictures depicted on those in use. There's a lot of good resources out there. And certainly if you have more questions on this, I'd be happy to answer those for you. Don't want to go into a lot of detail on pest control tonight. I want to keep the time down, but basically, you know, because the fall garden is kind of off the typical season for a lot of our pests on the insect side, there's probably less pressure. There's probably fewer of them around. And so actually later plantings can sometimes avoid the peak of different insect populations. And so, you know, certainly insecticides are kind of our go-to tool in dealing with insects. There are other options, you know, trap crops are one possibility, floating row covers. You can certainly have refuge areas that are promoting, you know, natural enemies of the different insects. And all of those, you know, kind of go together when we look at integrated pest management. But certainly when it comes to insecticides, look at the label directions. In the resources you'll be receiving by email, there are actually links that go directly to our publications related to that. So utilize those sources. Disease control, basically the same thing. This is just a picture of downy mildew of cucurbit crops. I mention it because just yesterday, this was first found in Knox County for the season. So that's kind of the first time it's been found close this year. It is something that comes in from the south typically, although occasionally it'll show in on transplants earlier in the season. And so that's a very important crop to our commercial growers, very important pest for our commercial growers of cucurbit crops. And so certainly if you have the cucurbit family growing in your garden, it's worthwhile to look at having a fungicide program because the downy mildew can just absolutely destroy a crop in short order. And so now that it's here this season, it's worth protecting those crops. What's good on the disease side is typically we are in the drier period of our year. And so drier conditions we talked about earlier are better from a disease standpoint. But it doesn't mean that there's not going to be some diseases that you see, but by and large, you should see slightly less pressure in the garden. Yes.
Just one question on that. What must, somebody told me I thought, what must squashes to avoid squash growing?
So squash vine borers, I don't know that we can entirely avoid them. Planting late may get you some protection. So if you're planting for just a fall garden, but I don't know that planting early would totally miss them. And I wouldn't promise you that planting late would entirely miss them either. Yeah, and so I mean, it's one of those things that what we hope is not to have large populations. Now, what's good and bad about the squash vine borer is if you have a plant that's rooting down at the leaf nodes, lots of times it's less effective because it's able to grab water and nutrition from those roots, even though the main stem may be affected. And certainly we do have effective insecticides out there. On the organic side, there's probably less efficacious products, not that there's zero options, but some of the better options are kind of expensive.
If you clip off the ones that are affected, does that help to spread?
Yes, so you can actually, some people actually will cut into the stem because you can often find the squash vine borers, you'll see kind of like sawdust stuff coming out of the stem, and you can actually go in there and pull out a little grub essentially and remove it. And so if you do that, that's going to limit the damage there, and that's not going to be an adult that comes out and can reproduce. So that would help, and especially in a backyard where you may have a handful of plants and you're looking at them frequently, that's not a bad approach to it. And so certainly some physical control would be a good option. So yeah, with a lot of these, again, it's not that we can completely avoid any pest pressure, but we do hopefully see less pest pressure by doing a fall crop. I'll mention again, I talked about it earlier about fertilizing. One thing to be aware of if you're not is in-season fertilization for vegetable crops, particularly nitrogen. We don't put all the nitrogen down that a crop would need at the beginning because nitrogen can move on us. It can be carried away by water. It can actually be turned into nitrogen gas to the atmosphere, depending on conditions in the field. So we don't put everything down at the beginning because we would lose it anyway and it wouldn't be there at the end. So what you see here is from our publication, Getting the Most Out of Your Home Vegetable Garden Soil Report. And again, soil testing is something I would recommend to folks every 4 or 5 years in their home gardens. It's not that it's a requirement or that you have to do it, but it can be a good thing, particularly if you're seeing problems. Just on the soil side, I'll just mention, please don't ever use lime without having a soil test telling you to. Lime is not a nutrient. It modifies the chemical environment of the soil. It makes nutrients more or less available. It's good when you need it. It's bad when you don't need it. So I have run into gardens that have extremely high pHs because they routinely limed it whether they had a soil test or not. And because of that, they created problems. So don't look at lime as fertility because it's not. It's actually modifying that soil environment. So definitely only use lime whenever you have a soil test that recommends it, and only at the rate that is recommended. So to that end, nitrogen fertilization, on many of our crops, we do mid or late season fertilization on these crops to make sure they have what they need. So you can see things there like tomatoes and peppers. When we actually have fruits on the plant that are 1 inch in size, we would come in and do some nitrogen fertilization. Now, it's not a tremendous amount. You can see here, these rates are per 100 feet row. And certainly many of our gardens have fewer than 100 feet of tomatoes or peppers. So you would adjust accordingly. You also see there for things like vining crops or cucurbits, when those vines are about 1 foot long, when they're beginning to spread, we would do this in-season fertilization. You will often hear this referenced as side dressing, is another name for this activity, because literally, especially in commercial fields, you would come along and apply this beside the crops that are growing. And so you see the table there, and you can reference that later. But this is important to make sure that crops do have fertility all season long. And what's important, if you don't have good fertility there for that crop, you're not going to have good harvest. And so it is important that we're making sure we're providing those plants with what they need. Sometimes for a year, maybe even two, we can get away if we're kind of skimping on the fertilizer, but we quite literally are digging ourselves a hole if we're not replacing it. So anytime we pull a crop out of a given area, we're removing nutrients. And if those nutrients aren't put back, we will see some limitations in the future. And again, there's a lot of opportunities with fertility products, compost, and things like that. So be aware that you do have options out there. Weed control tips, basically the same things we would see in a garden any time of year. One of the biggies is don't let weeds go to seed. Because when a weed plant goes to seed, not every seed germinates at the same time. So that means next year, you'll see some of those weeds pop back up from the seed you produced last year, and the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that, and so on. There are some weeds that have been shown to last in soil for decades. So it is a scenario where if you let things go to seed, you will have weed problems in the future. Oftentimes, it is useful also to keep more border areas weed-free as possible, so that doing things like mowing or using string trimmers to keep those weeds down, not letting them reach maturity and going to seed, because seed has a way of moving into our gardens, whether we want it to or not, whether it's by wind or water or sometimes even animals coming in. If we are using things such as manure, we do want to use things that are well composted. And let me say that composting is a process that should be followed with records of turning and temperature. I say that because the way that compost kills weed seeds, for instance, is by reaching a high enough temperature. And if you're not very intentional with it, it may look like compost, be broken down, but if it didn't reach high enough temperature, you can still have viable weed seeds in it. And that creates a problem for you in your garden. There's another issue to be aware of whenever we're talking about manures, and that's herbicide carryover. So there's been about 4 instances this summer where I've gone out to gardens and I've seen this pretty evident. Herbicides that are used on the forages, so on the hay or pasture where the animal is feeding, is carried over into their manure. It doesn't break down. And because of that, it's herbicides that are actually killing broadleaf weeds, and that's to say non-grass plants that are out there in the hay or pasture. Well, most of our garden plants are not grasses, and because of that, if we have manures that are contaminated with this herbicide, we will have problems in the garden. So this is something we've seen a couple of times this year. If you saw my latest newsletter, you actually read about it in there. So I won't beat a dead horse, so to speak, but certainly if you don't know where the manure is coming from and you can't ask the folks, you know, what sorts of herbicides are you using in the pasture? Or, you know, are you buying in forages, hay, for instance, from elsewhere that could have been using it? If you're not able to ask those questions of the source, then I would recommend you kind of trial any manure or compost that has manure in it. And to do that, basically you plant something like tomatoes, which are extremely sensitive, in a pot with it, as well as a pot without the manure or compost, and see if you have any effects. It's called a bioassay. Sounds very high tech, but literally you grow plants and see if they grow okay. That's about the only way that is cost efficient for a home gardener to even consider testing manures. And so that may be something you'd like to do. I encourage you to do it if you can't get those answers about the manure source. And of course, definitely other mulches can also have weed seed in them, and we want to make sure that we don't, bring problems into our garden. The other thing to be aware of is, and it goes back to how not every weed seed germinates the next year. If we can avoid tilling gardens, we're actually doing a lot of good. And among those is not bringing up weed seeds from what's called the seed bank or the soil seed bank. We also are improving the aggregation of our soil, which is important for soil health. And so there's a lot of reasons not to till in our garden if we can avoid it. And among those is weed control, because we're not bringing up new seeds to germinate. So just be aware, limiting tillage can be a good thing for several reasons. Cover crops, if you've never used cover crops in your garden, it's a good practice. It protects your ground from erosion. It adds organic matter. If you remember back earlier, we talked about organic matter, how it's a way to add nutrition as well as storage of nutrients and water. It loosens heavy clay, so it's always a good thing. It basically competes with weeds, so we don't have weeds growing that area if we have our cover crop growing there. And it can add nitrogen if we're looking at growing a legume. So something like a clover, like a pea, or something like that, we can actually add nitrogen into our ground and reduce the amount of fertilizer we need to put into the garden. And it also functions as a rotation crop. So it can help prevent the buildup of diseases and insects. So for a lot of home gardeners, something like a winter wheat or winter wheat mixed with Austrian winter pea works well. They can be sowed later in the season. They grow over winter, and then you would turn those under in the spring. And certainly, that's one way. If we are going to use tillage, utilizing cover crops kind of helps offset some of the damage we do with tillage, because we are adding those crops back into the soil. So with that, we're about finished. I'll just mention, if you're on Zoom, please feel free to add any questions you have in the chat, and we'll get ready here in a moment to let you ask questions verbally. But I always like to remind folks that gardening is a skill and not a gift. Now, I know sometimes people want to argue with me because they say, Grandma, she had a green thumb, she could grow anything. But Grandma had been doing it for decades. And so part of this is, while truly there are some individuals that may be blessed or better at this than others, there are also, the ability for the average individual to be a competent gardener. So I think one of the biggest things with gardening is trying things. So just getting out there and doing it is a great first start. The other thing I always like to remind, and sometimes newer gardeners, this is important, a very small, well-maintained garden is often better than a large, poorly maintained one. So don't let your enthusiasm get away from you. Be realistic what you have the time and effort to do, and you will get more out of 2 plants than you will out of 20 if they're not taken care of. So just be aware of that and don't let things get away from you. So with that, I'll just thank you all for your attention this evening.